Okay, I am recording. So let me brief you on my introduction. Will everybody please mute themselves except Joe Ferguson and Curt? So welcome to another Fraser special under the umbrella of the Lyceum team. This team, for those who don't know, is a forum at Fraser for exploring new knowledge on important subjects that teach and inspire. No reflection on Curt Eshelman, but I'm sure we would all love never to hear from him again about COVID. But sadly, this is not the case. He is and has been a wealth of information for us. I think he blames me for constantly dragging him back in, but I think he really likes what he's doing. It gives him a chance to make sense out of COVID and sum up his regular email publications. So let's begin. I'm Art Oakner, and today it's my honor for the 13th or 14th, which is it, Curt?
I think 13.
Time to introduce Fraser's own Dr. Curt Eshelman, presenting Catching Up with COVID. Are we out of the woods? So a little bit about Curt. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Curt has worked tirelessly, many hours a day on making sense of COVID and all it entails. This effort has made him something of a clearinghouse for very many smart, scientifically qualified people who continually add to his knowledge base. A word about Curt that we will all profit from. I love saying this. Curt finds truth, beauty, and essential goodness in graphs and the olive. So before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. When Curt comes on, I'm going to spotlight him. That puts everybody into a speaker position and your screens will change. So this event is going to be recorded. Your name will not be seen, but your picture will, unless you take it off by going to the bottom and re-hitting the camera. If you know anybody, or if you can't stay for the whole thing, I'm putting this onto a thumb drive and I'll give them out as needed. And Curt's going to put it on YouTube. Right, Curt?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Please keep yourself muted, but feel free to unmute yourself during the Q&A. Let's just be civilized. If you have a question, just take your mute off and ask your question. And if you know how to use the chat function, send the questions to me. So listen, staying safe. And where are we? In the woods. Get your questions ready. Take it away, Dr. Eshelman. Yay.
Thank you. Thank you, Art. Some thumbs up. Everybody hear me fine? My voice level's good? Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is a fun one. The potential that things are really changing, that the Omicron surge has pushed us over from this being an epidemic infection into being an endemic infection. I think that's a very real possibility, a very hopeful possibility. So I'm going to share slides like I've done before, just to keep me straight. So let me bring up the slides, and you all see those, and you see me. Again, some thumbs up, please, if you're seeing the slides. Okay, good. So this is my wife out here. She had a gray coat with a belt, a cloth belt coat there, red hair, long socks. This picture was taken in 1964. I have no idea who the photographer is, but the question is, are we out of the woods? But first, everybody know what day it is today? It's the Ides of March. How many of y'all took Latin in high school? It was terrible. But anyway, it's the Ides of March. It's the 2062nd anniversary of the murder of Julius Caesar. So you think the Roman numerals are bad. The Roman calendar was worse. The Ides of March is either the 13th or the 15th of the month. So for 8 months of the year, the Ides is the 13th of the month. And for 4 months of the year, it's the 15th of the month, and that includes March. And there's two other key days that they had. They had the Nones, which is 9 days before the Ides, and the Kalids, which is the first day of the next month. And they numbered their calendar by how many days until the Ides or after the Ides or until the Kalids or from the Nones. And astonishing that they kept up with that. So really, I'm not making this up. So let's go on. This was the conclusion of my talk from about 2 months ago, not quite 2 months ago, when I predicted that COVID would be over and that it would be over this spring. And what I meant, of course, is that it would be over as an epidemic and it would shift gears. It would make the transition into being an endemic illness. Endemic illnesses are infections that just circulate through society. It's like colds and flu and infectious diarrhea and all those sort of ordinary things that are problematic, but we begin to take them for granted. We don't like them, but we take them for granted. Some of them are serious. There's serious infections that are endemic, things like malaria and tuberculosis. Well, those are endemic diseases. So an endemic disease does not mean that it's not serious. But I think when COVID goes endemic this spring, no more masks, distance, outside only. And I think we're going to be able to say yes to concerts, yes to travel, yes to restaurants, and yes to museums. So this is the outline over here on the right that I want to do. The first group of things are very similar to what I've done before. I want to show you the progress that we're making. I want to talk about therapeutics, the vaccines and the medications. I want to divert for a couple of slides into talking about high-risk folks and then variants. We got to talk about variants. I'm going to stop there and we'll do questions and discussions at that point. But then I want to go on and do some stuff that's different than I've done before. I want to do some calculations about what's the risk. What's the risk of actually going out? And then I want to make a comparison to influenza because I think that's a good way for us to start thinking about COVID in the endemic phase. And I'll end with some predictions because it's always fun to come back to the predictions and see what I got right or not. So starting first with progress. This is a slide. I'm going to do a series of these. This was the slide from January 20th when I gave the last talk. And you see, I was cautiously optimistic that we had reached the peak of the Omicron surge. And in fact, that has turned true. We have dropped like a stone. For those of you who've followed these before, this is a classic Belgian curve. It's symmetrical, it skyrockets straight up, it peaks and it drops like a stone. I want you to notice how low we have come. This is lower than we were any time except during the summer lull last year. We are below the bridge between Delta and Omicron. We're certainly lower than last, and we're lower even than back here. And then when you get all the way back to 2 years ago, June, we didn't have enough testing to have it be comparable. So we are getting there. The number of cases is dropping a lot. This was the hotspot map. This is a by county published by the New York Times, and the redder and darker it gets, the more vicious the epidemic is in that county. So this is what the country looked like. It was sort of burnt toast 2 months ago, and this is what it looks like now. Wonderful pale yellows showing up. Some places are just, and you see Colorado's got this rim to the east and south that tends to hook up with northeastern New Mexico and the Panhandle. That's a problematic section. Other places, this part of Colorado is doing fine. This part of Colorado is not doing so well. And we got places from from Idaho to Maine that are still not getting there. But overall, the country's doing great. Notice these white counties that are picking up. You see these little white patches. These are counties that have not had a case of COVID in the last 7 days. And as we go forward, we're going to see more and more of those white patches. That's just terrific. Um, the walking around graph, most of you, well, there's some newbies here. Let me explain. This is a graph that says if you just walked around Boulder County at random, how many people would you run into before you found one that was contagious? And so 2 months ago in Boulder County, it only took 21 people. 20 in any group of 21 random people, one of them would be contagious. That's terrible. And of course, there were other places. Durham, where I came from, was worse. And the worst in the country was Miami, where every 8th person was contagious. But now we're up to 421. We've gone from 21 to 400. Now the graph kind of looks the same because I changed the scale. See the 700? It goes all the way up to 700 so we can fit Houston in. Look at the last one where the scale only went to 30. So this looks kind of similar to this. High in this is good, of course. You want to have to see more people. Low numbers are bad. So I actually put the numbers from 2 months ago into a scale that goes to 700, and this is what it looks like. So this is the valid comparison. This is the data from 2 months ago where low is bad, and this is where we are now. Tremendous improvement. And this is the contest. I know everybody is hanging on this contest, where I did an extra smoothing step of the Johns Hopkins daily data. And you see this swooping down. The red arrow shows where we are today. And the black arrow is where I project we will drop below 20,000 cases per day. I just made up the 20,000. This is just sticking my finger in the air and saying 20,000 is a good number, but it does reflect CDC guidelines for when they were going to declare cases at the not the high transmission level. So I have sort of declared 20 is the day when we're officially go to endemic, and right now that's scheduled to be March 25th. But the rate of decline is itself declining. We are plateauing more and more. And so it's unlikely that Bill has a shot at this anymore. He will still be the winner if we get there by the 18th, but we'd have to drop crazy hard in the next couple of days. So Stan, I think you probably are the man, but there is a possibility that this will start back up. I'm going to talk more about that possibility later. And if it does, Stan might lose his place and Frank is next in line. I don't even want to think about Gene being the last. But anyway, so I've said all this. Still too close to call. Best call is the 26th. All right. So let me talk about progress. It's a three-legged stool before we can be comfortable with COVID as an endemic illness. The first leg is the cases have to go down. There has to be fewer cases of COVID. The second leg of the stool is the severity of the illness has to go way down. We have to be confident there's not so many people dying and there's not so many people going to the hospital. And then the third is we have to be convinced our vaccines and our medicines are working. So let me talk now about the severity of illness. This again was the slide from January 20th, where we saw the drop in the percentage of people that go to the emergency room that went there for COVID. And it had already started down 2 months ago, but look at it now. So it peaked at nearly 14%, meaning 14% of the people who in the whole country walked into an emergency department, 14% of them ended up with a diagnosis of COVID, as opposed to now we're way less than 1%. So that's really good. People are not going to the emergency room with this illness. This is hospitalizations. Again, this is the slide from the 20th, And there was this hopeful little drop, making me think on the 20th that it had started down. This is the different age groups. So the one we care about, this is the old folks home, of course. People over 70 is in this sort of dark purple line. And indeed now it has dropped way down. It's below where the Delta was, but we're still ahead of the summer lull. But this is very, very good. I'm going to show you Boulder County's hospitalization data in a minute. So deaths. When I gave this in January 20, there was all of this screwy bouncing around because reporting over Thanksgiving and over Christmas is very disturbed. People just don't get the paperwork done to get deaths recorded. So it was surely going up, but we didn't know how bad it was going to get. And in fact, it got very bad. Not as bad as way back here when we didn't have vaccines, but we had more people die during the Omicron phase than the Delta phase. But again, notice it's back down. Deaths, the reporting of deaths lags hospitalizations and cases. So we're several weeks behind in the progress, but we've already gotten down to about the level we were between the Delta and the Omicron phases. So this is encouraging progress, but there's still people dying out there. This is a daily death rate that still has COVID, the third largest cause of death in the United States. Heart disease is number one, cancer is number two. COVID is the third leading cause of death in the country today. Here's the Boulder cases. Look at this. Talk about a Belgian curve. How cool is that? Spiky right up and right down. And you notice we're down to 69. In the old way that the CDC had us keep track of transmission risk in a community, 50 was the magic number. There's actually a later edition of this. I didn't change out the slide where we're in the low 60s. So, but I don't know if it's my next, no, it's not my next slide. I'll come to the CDC's new way of doing that. We are at low transmission by the CDC's current measure. This is hospitalizations in Boulder, where we peaked at the peak of the Omicron. We were at about 114 people in the hospital, in a Boulder County hospital, 114 people on any given day at the peak. And now we're down to 7. So hospitalizations have dropped from 114 to 7. That's probably the biggest piece of good news in the whole talk. Deaths will drop likewise, but the last 2 weeks have not been recorded. So what we can see is that Omicron deaths exceeded Delta deaths, but were not as great as the wave of deaths that happened before vaccinations. Vaccinations, of course, came in right here, and then we had the summer lull. We had a very nice stretch. Fraser cases. I know there's a COVID update that came out today, but before that, and that one, we have one case. Somebody in the peaks is sick with this. If that person is on the call and feels okay about it, I'd love for that person to talk a little bit about this. But of course, I don't know who that person is, and if that person would prefer to be anonymous, don't speak up. But I do want to point out, though, that if in cumulative cases, just for this year, we've had 83 total cases. So for us to go from 83 to 1 is rather like the progress we're seeing everywhere else. It's a lot like the hospitalizations and the case numbers. And this is the CDC's way of grading us now. If the number of cases per 100,000 in the community are down, then they look at 2 measures of how your hospitals are doing. Our hospitals are doing great, and so we get the green. And that's why many places in Boulder now are mask-free, including us, for those of us who wish for it. Okay, so we've done the number of cases. That's the first leg. We've talked about the progress and severity of illness. That's the second. The third is we have to be convinced that our medications and our vaccines are going to work. So let me talk about those. Vaccines, how well are they working? Well, they're not working like they did in the beginning. Remember in the beginning, they were 95% effective. 95% of cases were prevented in the very beginning. Well, the problem is we're using the same vaccine we started with. And the virus that they developed that vaccine for has been extinct for over a year. So we are getting a vaccination for an extinct virus. They're working on an Omicron specific virus, but this is a snapshot from the first week in January where it was essentially all Omicron. And you can see the comparison of those of us with vaccinations and boosters, how many cases per 100,000 compared to the unvaccinated. So by this measure, we have only 16% of the risk of getting infected as the unvaccinated person. But there's a trick here, and that is that 90% of, and this is all for old people, this is only 65 and older. So almost 90% of people 65 and older have been vaccinated, and 2/3 of them have had the booster. So these unvaccinated people are a small minority of the folks over 65. And you got to wonder if they're making bad choices and not getting vaccinated, what other bad choices are they making? I don't think the lifestyle of people in this box is the same as this. And I believe these people are probably exposed much more. So I believe this is an overstatement of how effective our vaccinations, and they're still working. But I bet it's more like our risk is 1/3 or even 1/2 of the unvaccinated people. So it's better though when we look at deaths. If you look at how many deaths are more accurately recorded. And so if you go back to that first week in January, again for people in the oldest age group, we are dying at only a 4% of the rate of the unvaccinated people. So this has come out over and over again. Our current vaccines protect us somewhat against getting sick, but they're not great for that. But they protect us quite well, almost you can say very well, against needing to be in the hospital and potentially dying. So will we need a second booster? Yes. Pfizer, just today, I don't know how many of you saw this, Pfizer sent out a press release and applied to the FDA to approve a second booster for those of us in high-risk groups. I'm very interested in that. I would like to travel some in May, and I'd like a second booster before I go. I would prefer that it was an Omicron-specific booster. They're working on that too, but I think we will need more boosters. Medications, I really want to emphasize this, that there are a number of medications where if you get sick, say you're the unlucky one and you in fact get sick, that if you take that medicine in the early days of getting sick, it prevents the disease from getting any worse. COVID is a disease that starts easy and gets worse and worse and worse and worse over 5 days or a week. And so most people are staying at home for 5 days or a week, and then they're sick enough to go to the emergency room, and some of them end up in the hospital. So the idea is to test early and get some of these medicines. Now, these are the 3 that are recommended most highly by the CDC. Paxlovid is number 1, and then it's a tie between the monoclonal antibodies. For a while, there wasn't enough Paxlovid to go around, but I think they got that pretty much fixed. So Paxlovid is the only name you really need to remember. And it's back to the Latin, pax being the Latin word for peace, and lovid being a construction of love and COVID. So this is a peaceful love of COVID pill. Is that gross or what? But in fact, that's the name, and maybe it's memorable. It's Paxlovid. It's the only pill in this category. And I think that you take 2 pills a day for 5 days or something like that. So all of us ought to have a plan. All of us ought to say, who would I call? Who's the doctor that's going to prescribe this? I do want to mention that there was a New England Journal of Medicine article just today about a Merck product, unpronounceable, and I won't even try to say it because you might remember it. This is a really questionable drug. The FDA advisory committee, the vote was really close as to whether to even license this thing. They came out showing comparable preventions, but this messes with the genetic material of the virus. That's the way it works. And the FDA advisory panel worried about, we don't have long-term tests. Is this messing with the genetic material of people? So this one gives me the creeps. I would not take this one. I would take my risk with COVID rather than to take the Merck drug. But I'll be in line for Paxlovid if I need it. Okay, the national name for this, Joe Biden announced this in the State of the Union. It's called Test to Treat, and the government is sending out free COVID test kits. It is astonishingly easy, way easier than the Colorado site. Get your pencil. This is the website, covidtests.gov. Everybody got your pencil? It's not hard. COVID tests, all one word, .gov. That gets you to a post office site. You put in your name and your address. That's about it. There's no charge, and it comes in the mail. We got ours in 5 days. So I'm going to hold this on here and say this one more time. I saw somebody running for a pencil. covidtests.gov. The idea is everybody in independent living in Fraser should have this. And if you get feeling like you're coming down with a cold, you have a fever, you're fatigued, there we go. Another success. Not everybody can see it, but please get these because it's easy. And if you start coming down with a feeling like, oh, I'm getting a cold, gee whiz, you test yourself and you test yourself multiple days in a row. And if it turns positive, then you call your doctor and say, man, I want that Paxlovid. I want that peace-loving COVID. So, all right, that's therapeutics. So the third leg of the stool is good. You with me on this? Cases are way, way down. Measures of severity are way, way down, and our therapeutics are working. So that can give us confidence that this thing is an endemic illness, is something we're going to be okay with. All right, a little bit about high risk, folks. I really want to push this other medicine, Evusheld. This is designed for people where the vaccination didn't work. If you're immune deficient and your doctor says we can't trust the vaccination, you should now talk to that doctor about Evusheld. It's monoclonal antibodies. These are laboratory produced antibodies that imitate the function of our body's own antibodies. And it's a mix of two of them, but they have this incredibly long lasting behavior. You get one shot of Evusheld. 3 months later, half of that medicine is still in your system. Half of it is still there to fight off an infection. And 3 months after that, you still have a quarter of the original dose 6 months later. So they think this shot may well work for 6 months. So for a lot of people who are worried because the vaccination didn't work, this is great. Now, I got to say that the research project that they did on this was a very small number of people. Enough so that a person ought to say, well, gee, I wish we had more people in the trial. The other thing is it caused some serious complications. So this is not a slam dunk. What is a slam dunk is you should talk to your doctor about it. But if you and your doctor decide together that the vaccination probably did work some good and this stuff maybe is more of a risk to you than not taking it, okay, I can buy that. This isn't for everybody. But talking to your doctor, if you're immune compromised, absolutely talk to him about Evusheld. All right. So let's talk about variants. I love this. This is a slide from 3 months ago in a week, where the biggest question was, will Omicron make us quit worrying about Delta? Well, Delta's extinct. Delta's gone. That's we're seeing evolution in play here. In a 3-month period of time, one virus has pushed the other one to extinction. Let me show you the CDC. This is a complicated thing, but it isn't really that complicated. Each of these columns, it represents the CDC's sampling of viruses for a week. They have sampling all over the country, and they detect what variant is present in the country. So back here in the first week of December, it was the orange is Delta. It was essentially all Delta with this tiny little sliver of purple. Purple, of course, turns out to be Omicron. Now, the next week, this is when I gave my lecture, here was Omicron appearing. And the question was, is it going to make us forget about Delta? Well, over a course of just 4 weeks, Omicron took over 90% and pushed Delta down to 10. And over about 4 more weeks, Delta's gone. So now this is the original. This light purple is the original. And it's named just a B dot and a whole bunch of numbers. It's kind of like the Dewey Decimal System. They keep adding dots and numbers. But this was the B, and it was a .1. But this other one was there from the very beginning, and you can see it's enough different that rather than just giving it numbers, they gave it an A. It's a BA.1.1. Well, of course, I nicknamed that Badass, so you can remember. This is Badass number 1. And Badass number 1 is pushing the original into extinction. Notice now down here, the pink is coming up. This is Badass number 2, BA.2. BA.2 is up to about 12%. In Europe, BA.2 seems to be more contagious than Badass 1. So it hasn't happened yet in this country, but in Europe, Badass 2 has taken over. So if I said all of this, original is down to about 15%, Badass 1 is almost 75%, and Badass 2 is below 12%. The good news though, Badass 2 being more, if it probably is more contagious. And if it is more contagious, we could have a surge because of that. There'll be some people who've been able to kind of hide from earlier versions of Omicron, and the Badass 2 variant may go find them. So we may have ourselves a little surge coming up from that. But there's no evidence that it causes more serious disease than the original form of Omicron. And there's no evidence that it makes a difference in terms of our vaccines or the medications. Okay, having said that, the variants will continue to be an issue all the time. It's going to keep happening. As we have fewer cases, there of course will be fewer mutations and fewer new variants, but they still will come. And I think our vaccines will need to be updated for the various variants. It's going to be a lot like influenza, where the influenza mutates, and we never know which variety of influenza is going to come every year. And so they give you a mix. When you take the flu shot, you get a mix, I think usually aiming at 3 different varieties. And that kind of thing is going to happen with COVID. I bet we're going to get into a thing where we're taking a vaccine booster every fall. At least all the old people will, and it'll be changed from year to year. Okay, so there we go. We've finished this first part here. I'm going to stop sharing, and so we can open up here. Let's kind of wake up a little bit, people, and questions.
Pete Dawson has a question. The world will have fewer new variants if it has fewer cases, but are the cases going to be low in the third world? Good question.
And I'm not sure I heard it all.
Pete?
Yeah, well, we look forward to having fewer variants, but that depends on having fewer cases. And I'm wondering about the rest of the world outside the United States and outside Europe, whether Asia and Africa are going to have fewer cases, because we need that in order to keep ourselves safe
Yeah.
from variants.
Yeah, I think everybody understood what Peter said, that let's assume my optimistic spin on what's going on in the United States holds, and this thing is it doesn't work if stuff is going crazy in other parts of the world. There have been, there's a curious lack of COVID in Africa, and we don't quite understand whether that's um, uh, something about climate or whether there's people live in better ventilated spaces. I've not heard a coherent explanation. South Africa, which of course is more European in style and more temperate in climate, has it. China is I think a big question mark. And in places, Hong Kong is going absolutely crazy. It's terrible in Hong Kong right now, with very high death rates as well as high cases. So as long as this keeps propping up in other places of the world, those places will generate variants, even if we're not.
Yeah.
Absolutely true.
If you have a question, unmute yourself, ask away, and we could be civilized.
Go ahead, thank you.
Curt, thank you again very much for a very clear presentation. Some of the writing emphasizes long infections, so-called long COVID, with people having symptoms for months, stretching to many months. Could you say anything about what you understand about that risk?
Yeah, and there was another good article just today. There was an article that came out. I tried to read and couldn't understand. It was all this astonishing immunology. If Tom saw that one, we'll get Tom to talk a little bit about it. But the long COVID is clearly a real thing, and probably it's more than one thing, and that's why it's so confusing to the researchers now. The long COVID, they're most commonly using 4 weeks as the dividing line. So you have the disease, and if you're still having symptoms more than 4 weeks later, they're calling it long COVID. Well, that ends up being a mix of people that were just really pretty sick and are getting over it just fine, but it's taking longer. The second group it's people who had organ damage, people that were sick enough in the ICU and it damaged their kidneys or their heart or their lungs, because we know the virus goes to these places. So the second group is, they don't have anything fancy going on, but they had damage. They had real damage to their lungs or their heart or their kidneys or their liver, and they may never get completely over that. They had damage. The third group is, there is some evidence that some people have persistent viruses, that the virus locks on and lives there, and that's a creepy thing. But that some people just in fact don't ever get rid of it. And then the fourth group is, some people have autoimmunity, where the immune system, instead of targeting just the virus, actually kind of slops over and starts targeting yourself, and you get this autoimmune phenomenon. And then people are speculating that it's reactivating the Epstein-Barr virus, which is a virus most of us have had and store in here. So there are these theories going on for what long COVID is, and right now we lack a good marker to say that person has long COVID, this person's getting well, but it's just taken a while. So it's hard to even say what fraction of people have long COVID. But I think you can say that some people, even those that have mild cases, are going to suffer ongoing. It's a serious problem.
And is that a reason to be more careful than we're being right now?
I think for people in our age group, the bigger problem is just dying from
Curt,
it.
can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, saying, given that long COVID is a real thing and it's a problem, should we be more careful? I think it maybe shifts the risk reward. I think for old people, dying from this disease is the key thing. And organ damage. We have people in Fraser who still have damage from serious infections. So I would put long COVID third on the list of things people in our age group ought to worry about.
Curt, I have a question. These medications, have they been tested? Or maybe 5 years from now, we're going to have births that with defects or other illnesses. How are we rushing in?
We don't have. So the question is, have these medications been tested long enough
safe?
so that we're sure? And I think the answer to that's clearly no. This is all too new, and so you have to weigh when you're making a decision whether to take the medicine or not take it. The experts help us weigh what's the risk you're going to get super sick from COVID versus have some weird side effect from the medicine. And that Merck drug, I would put in the category that no, I don't like its mechanism of action. I wouldn't take that. But I think the Paxlovid, I would very much take. I will be on the phone to my doctor to get Paxlovid if I get sick. Let's take. I realize the time. We're really so. One or two more questions.
Okay, Curt,
Yeah.
Rudolph. I was considered immune compromised, so my oncologist gave me the Evusheld shots. Okay.
Yeah.
I also got the test kit from the government.
Yeah.
If I'm having symptoms now and I take that test with the government test, those monoclonal antibodies make me show up positive in the testing?
No, they will not. They're entirely distinct. And what the quick test, the government distributed test, is checking for a protein in the spike of the virus, your antibodies won't screw it up. Get the test; they're still good for you. One more.
One more quick question.
I've got a statement.
Do you happen to know what the rate of COVID is now in Hawaii? That never showed up on any of the places that I have looked.
What a jip! I don't. Well,
Okay.
Hawaii was really high. Tom, you went off my screen. Tom was in Hawaii when it's bad. Did you keep track? Is it better?
It was bad for a while and isn't bad
Wonderful.
anymore, I think. Yeah, I don't know, Curt.
I think the truth is we don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to share screen again.
Curt, before you do that, when I've got my email on chat, if anybody needs any of these addresses, email me. I'll send you what you need.
I follow Hawaii on the New York Times
Jennifer Bull.
tracker, and they had 21 new cases yesterday. They're doing a lot better.
Great. Somebody actually knows something. That's always good.
Okay.
Here we go. So I'm going to do something a little new. I'm going to try and have you get a feeling for what the risk is. Let me go on to, so if you move back into normal life and you do normal kinds of things, what's the risk that you're going to catch it? What's the risk you might die? And I'm going to calculate all of that. So what I chose to walk you through is consider for a moment that you're invited to a dinner party at some dear friends, and their kids are going to be there. You've known them for a long time. It's a great chance to catch up with these people. They're wonderful folks. You would really like to go to the party, and there'll be 10 people there besides yourself. So let's consider the risks of going to a dinner party in Boulder right now in which 10 other people will attend. So the risk, you have to look at three things. First, what's the risk of somebody else coming who is contagious? First, obviously, if nobody's contagious, you got away with it. The second is what's the risk you will catch the disease from that contagious person? And third, what's the risk you'll die from that illness? So I'm going to do a bunch of calculations. And I know there's some of you out there that already got your calculators out and are going to follow along with me. There's some other people who are saying, holy cow, put me to sleep. So take a nap. I'm going to ring a bell at the slide that will be the final time to wake up for the punchline. But in the meantime, let me walk you through these calculations. So the first is the walking around graph. If we're trying to figure out how many contagious people this is the starting point. There's about one contagious person for every 421 people. Now, it would seem like you could just do simple arithmetic. It's actually a little more complicated, but I'm not going to walk you through that. But I taking that same data, made this graph where the size of the group is down here, and I spaced it out 1, 5, 10, all the way up to 500. So if you go and there's a group of 500 in Boulder, it's a 70% chance that somebody in that group is going to be contagious. If we look back at our group of 10, it's a 2% chance. And you can see as the size of the group increases, it goes up and up. So some other common kinds of, just to carry this around, for 10 people in the group, 2%. For 20 people in the group, it goes to 5%. And for a group of 100, you're up to 21. So your family reunion, you probably have a 21% risk that somebody's going to be contagious. But for 10 people in a dinner party, it's about a 2% risk that one person will be contagious. So what's the risk you're going to catch it from that person? Well, we don't have a range all worked out for different activities. That's a frustrating thing that we don't know. But we do know the maximum. The maximum is if a person is infected, what is the risk that their spouse will become infected? That person's probably contagious for 7 or 8 days, and here they are living with somebody. So close, share a house or an apartment with somebody you're married to, what's the risk that the spouse will get it? Well, it's only 50%. In Norway, it's only 25%. That's amazing. Norwegians are so tough, they probably just open the window. But so start with that understanding that with maximum closeness, the highest risk is 50%. That's for vaccinated people who've had a booster. If it's a brief encounter in a ventilated space, the risk is essentially zero. If a stranger asks you for directions and you have a 30-second conversation outdoors, your chances of catching it approach zero. So everything else is somewhere in between. And science doesn't have a clear answer for all of those. But from studying the rates of transmit, 10% is a reasonable chance. So in that dinner party, you've got a 2% risk of somebody being contagious, and you've got a 10% chance of catching it from that person. So that gets you down to a 0.2%, or here the risk is 2 out of 1,000. So right now in Boulder, you go to a dinner party, there's 10 people there, your risk of coming home sick with COVID is 2 in 1,000. If you catch it, what's the risk that you'll die? We actually have better data on this. During Omicron, there was about 1 death for every 1,000 cases, but that took all age groups. So what we care about more is in elderly people, people over 70, this was for, there were 6 deaths for every 1,000 cases. Hear that? 6 deaths for every 1,000 cases, not quite 1%. So for every 1,000 elderly people, 6 will die. That's not zero, but it's a pretty small risk. In fact, there's a fun thing called micromorts that this epidemiologist talked about. I had about 6 slides on it, but it was like, all right, go. So she calculates that your risk of dying, you've all been driving a car for 60 years. Your risk of dying during those 60 years of driving is approximately the same as your risk of dying if you catch COVID. So we know people die from car accidents, but we wear our seatbelts and we take reasonable precautions, but we drive our car. So that's about the same risk of dying. But now, remember, this is if you get it. This is your risk of dying if you get it. Your chances of getting it were low, and we've got to multiply that. So here we go. Ready? Where's my bell?
Is this for vaccinated, Curt, or unvaccinated?
Yes, vaccinated and boosted. Wake up, whoever's not awake. The bottom line is if you go to a dinner party in Boulder now and are exposed to 10 people, your risk of dying because you did that is 12 out of a million. Well, we used to say 1 in a million is impossibly low odds. 12 out of a million is higher than that. But it's a pretty reassuring number. But it raises the issue of risk reward. And this is very personal. So the risk is very small. And if, as in the illustration I gave, it's a wonderful dinner party that you'd really like to go to, the reward for going, the emotional reward for going is very high. So the risk reward there for me would be easy. I'm going. But, if it was people you didn't want to get together with, hateful people, and you didn't want to go to that party, well, then maybe you'd say, okay, well, the reward is very small, and that 12 in a million risk is something I don't want to take. Interesting, Judy and I went for a walk on Pearl Street, just like old times, and went into the bookstore. And our granddaughter, we went back to the children's section, and we probably passed, 10 or 12 people, and then they're around, and we realized, for most of this time, this is a setting in which we would have had a mask on. And I didn't, and she put her mask on. And it was a kind of sense of the risk reward. I think our chances were less than spending an evening with 12 people, but Judy wanted the extra protection. What's the problem with that? I'm not even sure why I didn't put mine on, but I did. Okay, so comparison with influenza and predictions. I think the comparison with influenza has a lot of validity. We're used to influenza, and if we start to think, okay, we're going to react to COVID a lot of the way we react to influenza, it's getting us in the ballpark of what it's going to be like to live with COVID. Both of these are respiratory viruses. Both come in waves. Both have caused pandemics with hundreds of millions of deaths. Both have an endemic form, and both cause hospitalizations and deaths. And we have effective vaccinations for both, and we have effective antiviral treatments for both. The thing is, we're used to influenza. We don't like influenza. It's a bad illness. It makes you really pretty dang sick. It's not just a cold, but we're used to it. And we don't shrink away from having a normal life because influenza exists. So this is a slide from the CDC. I had to print the whole damn thing. Look at this. It's so much more busy than my slides. And I think these little pyramids, don't they look like nuclear warheads? They're sort of influenza warheads with the propellant, and here's the fuse. Anyway, each of these represents a season. So I took this as a representative season and a nice graphic as a way to think about this. In this year, influenza, there were 29 million cases. Remember, influenza comes through in a wave. So it was probably 29 million over about a 3-month period. Out of those 29 million, 380,000 were admitted and 28,000 died. We have really good data on that. We also have really good data on the Omicron wave, also lasting about 3 waves. But this was as an epidemic, not as an endemic. This was an epidemic wave. We had 3 times as many cases. We had 1 million hospitalizations, and 160,000 deaths. The projection of how this was going to be, how COVID will play out as an endemic is much more similar to endemic influenza, with about 22 million cases a year, 220,000 hospitalizations, and 35,000 deaths. Let me put all of these on one slide. I made the Omicron epidemic surge way bigger, but look at the two. This is for COVID and this is for influenza. I couldn't make my triangles any skinnier to match, but you can see similar. 20, 30 million cases is about what we would expect in these surges. Probably fewer hospitalizations with COVID, but probably more deaths. The people who get hospitalized with COVID have a harder time than with influenza. So, but it's in the ballpark. 29 versus 22 million, 380 versus 220, 28,000 deaths versus 35,000 deaths. In fact, these numbers are so soft, we could just say they're identical and we don't know any different. But it's a useful thing to think about. We are going to have influenza still, and we're going to have the equivalent amount of disease come from COVID as comes from influenza. Here's a graph. This is in England that showed the fatality rate at its peak before immunizations. COVID was more than 20 times as fatal as the flu. But now with immunizations and people being immune because of illness recovery, that has come down to COVID is about twice as lethal as the flu. Now, but notice this was January. This was still in the epidemic phase. And there are people that are talking about it is going to be very similar to influenza in terms of its lethality. Okay, let's acknowledge the limitations. COVID's never been an endemic disease. I think there's reasonable people talking about what it's going to be like. And these projections, I think, are more likely than not to come true, but nobody knows. Nobody can say this is what happened last year. And COVID-19 has surprised us. And variants could upset this apple cart. So let me make some predictions, and then we'll be done and take questions. Are we out of the woods? Yes and no. The disease is still here. I think the epidemic phase is going away. It's arbitrary what to say when it's going to be, but we are going to have it as an endemic phase, and being endemic does not mean it's pain-free. So comparisons with influenza, I think will infect similar numbers will die. It'll come in waves. I think the first wave will be in April and May. And that's because we've removed all of our restrictions, all of our control restrictions, and Badass 2 is on the rise. I think those two will add up to a wave in cases. But I think because essentially 90% of society has immunity, either because of illness recovery or because of vaccinations, it will be far less lethal. And that's so. After this spring wave, it will then settle into a seasonal wave and probably will come around once a year in the winter. It will be a common cause of colds, is the way most of us will experience it going forward. And essentially every child will get it. So every child will have some immunity to this. And then as they grow up, their own immunity. So there may not need to be vaccinations forever. But clearly in the short run, for high-risk people like us, vaccinations are going to be our source of immunity. So I've talked about all that. The Omicron-specific vaccine, I really am watching every day to see if there's anything about that. If the spring wave is significant and people are dying, and Omicron is specific vaccines are ready, then maybe some of us will get it this spring. They might give it to high-risk people this spring, but more likely it will be the booster we'll all get in the fall. Okay, I think the summer season is going to be wonderful. So all of us who are nervous about, is it over, is it not over, the summer number of cases is going to drop to almost zero, and nobody will need to wear a mask. Immune compromised, frail, whatever. The summer is going to be wonderful. There's going to be almost no cases, and anybody could do what they want. And then we're going to go back into a new pattern in the fall when it starts to come back. So, all right, I've talked about all this stuff. So, all right, finally my summary. And I put a picture in here. We lived in Japan for some years, and back in the early 70s, and Japanese people wore masks then. It was a courtesy. If somebody's sick, they wore a mask. Or if during flu season, everybody wore a mask. And if a young person had a pimple, they wore a mask to cover it up. Or if a woman didn't want to bother with makeup, she wore a mask. Masks were just completely common and taken for granted. And I think we'll keep having that. Or at least I hope we do. I hope this fall or this winter when we have the next wave that we'll all pull our masks out and wear some of those. Okay, so we're going to get booster shots. Isolation and quarantine when sick or exposed is still going to be important. Widespread mask use and some restriction of activity during the winter surges. Otherwise, I think society will function normally. Questions, discussion. Thank you everybody for being good audience, patient. You got anything in the chat box, Art, or?
No, not yet, but I'm going to put you into gallery and we'll see who's.
Can I make a comment?
Sure,
Yeah.
Tom.
You mentioned Hong Kong earlier, and I just want to point out that in Hong Kong, virtually everybody wears a mask in public all the time. They're having a terrible wave of COVID.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody knows why that's happening that way. I haven't heard it. Explanation.
Yeah, I haven't heard that. I did check their vaccination rates, and their vaccination rates are worse than ours. But they are having a gigantic wave with lots and lots of deaths. It's just terrible. There's other places like Norway that have had a lot of cases, but almost no deaths. And Denmark is another place that's had they took all their restrictions off and let her rip, and they've had a ton of cases, a huge number of cases, and a lot of deaths.
But in Hong Kong, the masks are not preventing this. And
yeah,
that's
I
a question of why.
Don, you look like you're talking, but you're muted, Don.
Unmute. I haven't heard your previous presentation, but I want to compliment you. For me and others that may not have heard them before, this was fantastic, and I can't tell you
Thank you.
how much I appreciate it.
I take more compliments from people too. Just keep them coming.
Okay,
you know,
let's go compliment.
Well, and we've used our hour. So, you know, I guess I'd like to leave you with the sense that, you know, it isn't time to go to a karaoke bar quite yet, but your risk of going to that dinner party is down to 12 in a million. I think that's pretty good calculation. So if you're ready to start doing some stuff, I think it's not a bad time. And this summer is going to be wonderful.
I think Ellen Kotz had a question, and there may be others as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to the East Coast in another 2 weeks. Do you think I should get another booster before I go?
East Coast is at least as, you know, the question of whether to get another booster is similar here as there. The difference, of course, is you're going to ride an airplane, you're going to be in airports.
Sure.
So did you get your booster in October?
Yes.
So we're now November, December, January, February, March. It'll be near 6 months. Yeah. If you can find somebody to give it to you, It's not approved though. So maybe if you go and tell them you're immune compromised, even if you're not, they'll give it to you.
Just go
I've
to
got the same,
Walgreens, just go to Walgreens and try to get it.
give it a try.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe your doctor's office, you'd have more luck.
Well, I
um,
asked the doctor and she said no, but that was before Pfizer applied for the new booster. So now when Pfizer applies for the new booster, it makes me think I ought to get one.
That's my reaction too. I mean, I think we know that the old booster, the immunity is waning.
Right.
So we don't have the antibodies in our nose or in our bloodstream anymore. And so the virus gets a foothold and our immune memory cells pour out the antibodies. So we fight it off better, don't have to go to the hospital, don't have the risk of dying, but we still get sick, and we can get pretty sick. Those of you who read my email thing, there was a person who kept a diary. It was just incredible.
Yeah.
Reading what she went through.
I
I've
have
got Margaret and Stan here,
question,
and
please.
Karen, I'll get you in second.
Okay, thank
Let me
you.
get to Margaret and Stan and then you.
Yeah, Curt, my question is, how hard are you going to try to get a booster before you climb on the plane for Europe in May?
I will work at it. And I know in Durham, they got them from the drugstores. So I would hope the Pfizer thing would be approved. I've got enough time for that to get through but I'll be at 6 months. And part of the approval process is the government will pay for it. So it may be the kind of thing where if you're willing to pay for it yourself, you can get it.
And will the presence or absence of that approval influence your decision to try to get the booster before you get on the plane?
I really have respect for the advisory committee of the FDA. More respect for the advisory committee than I do for the FDA. But they pulled together a panel of experts who will ultimately vote. And that Merck drug that I wouldn't take was like a 2-vote margin to be approved, where most of the stuff is unanimous. So if that group says it recommends approval to the FDA, well, usually the FDA just takes their recommendation and approves it within a week. You've got it. If that group says no, there's no evidence that we need it, I'd probably take their advice. That would certainly make me think less about getting it.
Karen, and then I'll get you, Sam.
Thank you. I have a very, very, very close dear friend who lives in Poland, within 6 hours drive from the border. And I'm wondering if you have any idea, we're watching these people, throngs, millions of people, refugees on top of one another. Do you have any idea if that's a super spreader for COVID?
It's got to be. It's just got to be. I think the only way it might not be is if they had their Omicron surge completed prior to the war breaking out. But yeah, you take millions of refugees and you pack them into the kind of places refugees go. That's going to spread not only COVID. You've got all kinds of other diseases in that setting that could just be terrible.
Thank you.
I've got a guy, Sam Bow. I've got you. It says Evusheld, I can't pronounce that, is an antibody treatment. The vaccine makes you immune. Your immune system create antibodies. Would Evusheld be a substitute for the fourth booster for these questions?
No, it would not. Evusheld's been tested far less than the boosters. I think we have a pretty clear idea of the risk of taking a booster, and it's very, very small. Evusheld's only been tested in like 100 people or something.
Yeah.
It has, even in that small group, had some pretty serious side effects. So I think Evusheld is potentially a replacement for the vaccine for immune compromised people where the vaccine didn't work. But I don't think, I think if you're immune compromised and after the vaccine, your doctor did the blood test to see if the vaccine took, and it did, then I'm not sure your doctor would recommend Evusheld given the side effects. That's a tricky, you need a competent doctor to make that choice for you, not me. But if you're immune compromised, for goodness sakes, talk to your doctor.
Okay, I've got a statement to make. I've got my second booster and I've been talking to others who have, and it's just a matter of getting aggressive. If you're aggressive and you want that booster, you'll get that booster. If you just wait, you won't. And we've got people leaving in droves, but what do you think? Well, it's late. I didn't mean that, but we missed, Curt, there's no Karnak, there's no olives, there's no toothpicks. I
Hey,
mean.
what? I had a prop.
Curt?
Any other questions? Joe?
Curt, yeah. Thank you very much, Curt. It was really nice presentation. And just for people's information, getting on a plane, we went to Hawaii 3 weeks ago, and I got my second booster before going, just by going over to Walgreens. Worked fine.
Ah, boy, that is good.
Yeah. You
I-
have to make an appointment. You have to make an appointment. Once you get there, you just have to say, yes, I'm immune compromised, and it works okay.
Okay, Carol?
Clint has been trying to ask a question or make a comment for a long time.
I got Carol Gerlitz. You want me to read it or can you say it, Carol? Carol says a stealth variant was mentioned on the news today. Is that the Badass 2 variant or something else starting?
Yeah, Badass 2 has been called the stealth variant. I don't have any idea what that has to do with it. There's a fun other variant. There's a cross between Delta and Omicron that exists where presumably the two viruses infected simultaneously and the core is Delta and the spikes are Omicron. But it's very, very rare and everything works against the spikes. So it's not a threat. It's probably not more contagious than anything else.
Yeah,
So we're going to keep hearing weird things.
Curt?
Yes.
There's suggestion that in sewage measurements and so forth, that Badass 2 is showing up, and our hoped for continuous decline may be not happening. We may be going back, and it could be substantial because only 45% of the people have had Omicron, and the rest of them haven't. Us haven't.
I looked just today at everybody know that there's 100 or so sites in the country where they check for the genetic material of the virus in the sewage. And it's kind of an early warning system. And there's a significant number of these sites that are seeing an increase in the virus. And they're thinking it might be the Badass 2. An interesting thing is that the state with the most increase in the virus is Ohio, and Ohio has a dramatic decrease in the number of reported cases. So I think this is probably a real indication that we're going to have a spring surge, but it's kind of hard to see how it's going to play out.
Okay, want to take one more?
Sure.
Who's the lucky person? Okay, if everybody would unmute themselves, we could applaud Curt for a lot of work.
Very
Thanks,
fun.
Curt.
Very fun. See you all.
Keep
Thank
wearing
you.
our masks when we go out? Should we keep wearing our masks when we go out from Frazier?
I think that's a risk reward. I think if you're going to be outside, absolutely not. I think if you're going to be in a small group of people, that you really value the opportunity to take your masks off, I would take them off.
Yeah.
I think I was probably stupid to not wear a mask in the bookstore, though.
I was, so we're gonna call it a night, and good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.